On the morning of the 26th of July, 1944, with the SS officers preparing to invade the ghetto and begin their grim task, Albert Battel made a decision. He would play the part of the fool, the inebriated, bumbling officer who had lost his way. He would pretend to be so hopelessly drunk, so entirely incompetent, that the SS would have no choice but to pause, hesitate, and question the orders they were following. The risk was monumental. If anyone suspected that his drunkenness was a ruse, Battel would be arrested, tried for treason, and executed. His family would pay the price for his defiance, marked forever in the eyes of the Reich. But Battel saw a flaw, a crack in the facade of the Nazi machine, a bureaucracy so rigid and unforgiving that it could be brought to a halt with the smallest disruption. If he could make the SS doubt his authority, question his orders, even for a moment, he might just buy time. Time for those who were slated for death. Time for the workers who had already been condemned. The hours stretched before him as he climbed into a military truck, the weight of the decision pressing on him. But in his heart, he knew that this was a choice that would echo through history, whether anyone ever knew it or not. When he stumbled out onto the bridge that connected the ghetto to the rest of the city, the bitter winter air cutting through his coat, his mind was focused not on the cold, but on the illusion he was about to create. He staggered, slurring his words just enough to make it believable, just enough to seem like a man who had lost his grip on reality. He ordered the driver to block the bridge, a simple act of defiance, but one that would disrupt the entire operation. When the SS arrived, furious at the obstruction, Battel met them with a vacant gaze, his expression a mask of drunken confusion. He told them he had orders to secure the area. Orders that didn't exist. The SS hesitated. They didn't shoot. They didn't arrest him immediately. Instead, they argued among themselves, questioning his orders, scrambling to confirm the non-existent instructions. And as they did, Albert Battel did what no one had expected. He opened the back of his truck and allowed over 30 Jewish workers to climb inside, workers who had been on the list, workers who had been marked for death that very day. He drove them out of the ghetto, past the confused guards, past the checkpoints, into a military barracks where the SS had no jurisdiction. By the time the sun set, the action had commenced, the trains filled with the dead, and the ghetto emptied out. But for 33 people, the clock had stopped. For them, the war had not yet claimed them. They were alive, and in the silence that followed, as the world continued to turn, no one but Albert Battel knew what had just happened. The cost of his decision was still unknown, but as he filed his routine report and returned to his quarters, he knew that the system had been outmaneuvered, if only for a moment. Battel's actions would soon be lost to the greater sweep of history, forgotten in the rush of the war, buried beneath the chaos of war crimes and atrocities. But for those 33 lives, his choice was everything. It was more than just an act of defiance. It was a chance, a fleeting chance at survival against a system designed to erase them. The photograph, silent and still, would never show the full truth. But for Albert Battel, his moment in time was a decision no photograph could ever capture. His name was Albert Battel. He wasn't a fanatic. He wasn't an ideologue. He wasn't even the type of officer one would expect to rise through the ranks of the Wehrmacht and, more importantly, the Nazi regime. He was a lawyer by profession, a man who had been molded more by rules and regulations than by any fiery sense of duty or loyalty to the Führer. A man who wore the swastika on his uniform and saluted it every morning, not out of conviction, but because it was what was expected of him. He had no deep-seated hatred of Jews, no thirst for the power the regime promised. He had simply joined the army as a matter of course, an obligation, a duty, a role he had slipped into as easily as one slides into a well-fitted coat. For Albert, war had always been something distant, a concept that existed in a world apart from the life he led in a small, quiet city. His work had always been bureaucratic, administrative, a lawyer navigating the labyrinth of military codes and laws. He had been trained to interpret, to smooth over the wrinkles in the law, to ensure that the wheels of the regime turned without obstruction. But in the days leading up to the summer of 1942, something began to shift in Albert's world. The papers he filed, The reports he signed, the very language he spoke, began to take on a chilling meaning. Przemysłowa, a small city that straddled the line between Nazi-occupied Poland and Soviet-controlled territory, was about to become a furnace. The presence of the Jews in the city was an anomaly, a stain on the otherwise efficient occupation of the land. Albert had never paid much attention to the men and women in the ghetto, those who had been herded into small, crowded quarters on the outskirts of the city. But that would change. By the summer of 1942, the machinery of extermination had arrived in Przemysłowa. The action, the mass liquidation of the Jewish population was already being planned. Albert knew what that meant, at least in the most clinical sense. He knew the trucks, the trains, the scheduled deportations. But what he didn't understand, what he couldn't have understood at the time, was how his own conscience would collide with the mechanized horror of the Third Reich. He wasn't a man given to grand speeches or ideological fervor. He had no belief in the superiority of the Aryan race, no hatred toward those who lived in the ghetto. He had, until then, simply been doing his job. He had learned early in life that morality was often an inconvenient luxury when weighed against the demands of duty. He didn't question the orders he followed. He simply carried them out. But that all changed when he began to witness firsthand the horrifying efficiency of the Nazi machine. The Jews in the ghetto were more than just a statistic to Albert now. They had names, faces, families. Some of them were his neighbors, people he had seen in the streets before the war. His legal training, which had always been about rules and compliance, suddenly began to feel like a mask, a shield that protected him from the violence of the system he was upholding. He had been trained to compartmentalize his duties, to believe that as long as he followed the rules, he was not responsible for the consequences. But the rules no longer made sense. They no longer fit within the world Albert could still somehow recognize. One evening, after his usual shift, he sat at his desk, looking over the papers that would seal the fates of the thousands of people waiting to be transported to the death camps. His hands trembled as he turned the pages. These were not just numbers, not just names on a list. They were lives, real lives, that were being erased from existence by an army of paperwork and orders. For the first time in his life, Albert felt the weight of the uniform he wore, the swastika on his sleeve, the rank he held. He wasn't just a lawyer. He was part of the system, part of the machine that was about to turn this city into a graveyard. And it was then, in the silence of his office, that Albert knew he would have to make a choice. The man who had been content to simply follow orders had suddenly realized that following them would make him complicit in something monstrous. He could no longer pretend that his actions didn't matter, that he was just a cog in the machine. But what choice did he have? What could he do against the power of the Reich? He had no weapons. He wasn't a soldier. He had no political connections. He couldn't fight on the front lines. And yet, somewhere deep inside, Albert knew that he had to act. The only way to survive, to live with himself, was to sabotage the system from within. It was madness. A man in his position had no business questioning orders, let alone defying them. But Albert saw no other way. He understood the system, its cold, mechanical efficiency. He knew that to stop it, he would have to work within it. The bureaucracy that had turned the lives of thousands into a paper trail could be turned against itself. But it would take cunning. It would take courage. It would take a man willing to throw away his career, his safety, and his very life. Albert was no fanatic. He didn't have the luxury of a moral high ground. He wasn't a soldier on a mission to destroy the enemy. He was a man facing a moral abyss, and for the first time in his life, he could see the cost of doing nothing. The moral clarity he felt in that moment would propel him forward, but it would also force him to wrestle with a deep, gnawing question. Could one small act of resistance ever be enough to make up for the evil he had been complicit in? And so, in the days that followed, Albert would make the most dangerous decision of his life. He would not raise a weapon. He would not take to the streets. He would not organize a resistance. No, Albert Battel would take a more subtle, far more audacious route. He would weaponize incompetence itself, a tool the Nazis had never counted on. It was a dangerous gamble, but it was the only chance he had. A man who had spent his life in the service of bureaucracy was about to become the most unlikely of heroes. But first, he would have to make the world see him as a fool. The city of Przemysłowa wasn't Berlin. It wasn't Warsaw. But in the summer of 1942, it was about to become something far worse. It was a pressure cooker, and the lid was about to explode. Nestled on the edge of the Eastern Front, Przemysłowa was a small, nondescript city with little to distinguish it from the countless others under Nazi occupation. Its streets were quiet, its buildings gray and unremarkable, but beneath the surface, a terrible transformation was taking place. The city was no longer just a strategic point in the war. It had become a focal point of human suffering. Its Jewish population crammed into a ghetto on the city's outskirts. The wire fencing and armed guards surrounding it turned the ghetto into something that resembled a prison more than a place where people once lived freely. The air was thick with fear, thick with the knowledge that something terrible was coming. The Jews of Przemysłowa had been rounded up and herded into the ghetto with brutal efficiency. They were given nothing but starvation rations, their lives reduced to a grim waiting game. The harsh winter had long passed, but the chill remained in the air, cutting through the thin coats of the men, women, and children trapped behind barbed wire. It wasn't just the cold that kept them awake at night, but the deeper chill of knowing that their fates had been sealed. It wasn't just the prisoners who felt the weight of what was to come. For those who served the regime, soldiers like Albert Battel, the city had become a pressure point. The far-reaching arm of the Nazi machine had moved into Przemysłowa, and the men who worked for it began to sense the violence waiting just beyond the walls. Officers who had spent their careers following orders were now grappling with the unspoken tension that filled the air, the looming realization that they were part of something monstrous. By 1942, the ghetto had grown far too large for the Nazis to ignore. The final solution was no longer an abstract plan whispered in dark corners. It was a reality unfolding across Europe, and in Przemysłowa, it was about to take a particularly brutal form. The SS had arrived, their orders clear: cleanse the city, exterminate the Jews. The date had been set, the trucks lined up, and the trains that would carry the victims to the death camps were ready. Everything had been meticulously planned, executed with the same chilling efficiency that had become the hallmark of the Nazi regime. But Przemysłowa, unlike other cities where the death marches had already begun, was not without its complications. It sat on a vital railway line, a crucial transit point for the Eastern Front. Its strategic importance had been noted by the military, and as a result, its officers had become more cautious, more reluctant to disturb the careful balance of occupation. The Wehrmacht, the German military, still held some sway here, and within its ranks were men like Albert Battel, men whose hearts had not yet been hardened by the horrors they were serving. In the thick of it, Przemysłowa became a microcosm of the larger horror sweeping through Europe. The SS were unrelenting, their brutality cold and bureaucratic. They viewed the Jews of Przemysłowa as nothing more than numbers, easily wiped from the map, their lives of no more importance than the soldier's next report. And yet there were whispers among the prisoners and even among the German officers of something more. It was a quiet, internal conflict, a ripple that ran through the ranks of the Wehrmacht. But it was there. Some of them began to see the truth of what was happening, and for some, that truth would become an unbearable weight. As the day of the planned liquidation of the ghetto drew nearer, the tension in Przemysłowa reached a breaking point. Albert Battel, sitting in his office, reviewing reports and signing papers, began to feel the pressure of the impending violence that would be unleashed. He wasn't alone in this. Others, perhaps more ideologically aligned with the Reich, turned a blind eye. But for Albert, it was becoming impossible to ignore. The city, quiet on the surface, was a ticking time bomb. Everywhere he looked, there were signs of it. Military trucks arriving in the dead of night, soldiers preparing for the action that was soon to unfold. He could hear the noise of the trucks pulling in, the jarring sound of boots on cobblestone streets, the whispers of guards at the checkpoints. There was an ever-present sense of urgency in the air, a feeling that something had shifted. The ghetto was full to the brim, and every day more were being brought in, their lives and identities erased by the Reich's cruel and efficient machine. But it wasn't just the Jews of Przemysłowa who felt the threat of impending destruction. The officers, too, began to feel the weight of their complicity. Albert, in particular, found himself wrestling with the realization that he was not merely a spectator in this operation. He was part of it. He had filed the papers, signed the reports, ensured that the train schedules were met. He had, in essence, aided in the destruction of the very people he had once walked past in the streets. The coming action wasn't something Albert could ignore any longer. It was a decision he had been avoiding, a decision that would force him to make a choice that could cost him everything. The weight of that realization crushed down on him as he walked through the city, past the soldiers preparing for what was to come. He knew that the day of the action, when it came, would be the moment when everything would change. The streets of Przemysłowa, once quiet and familiar, now felt like a labyrinth, each corner hiding the terror that would soon unfold. The people behind the barbed wire, men, women, children, waited, knowing that their lives were about to be swept away in a machine of murder and death. And Albert, though part of the machinery, was beginning to see it for what it was. A juggernaut of brutality, turning lives into numbers, transforming people into expendable pieces in a grand, terrifying plan. But for Albert, the time for ignoring it was running out. The clock was ticking, and soon, the lid on this pressure cooker would burst. The question was, would he stand idly by and let it happen, or would he act, and risk everything to stop it, if only for a few? Przemysłowa was about to explode, and Albert Battel had to decide which side of history he wanted to be on. It was all planned, the date, the trucks, the trains. The SS had already decided that 12,000 people were to die in cold, calculated efficiency. And everyone knew it. The morning of the liquidation dawned gray and bitter, the city cloaked in an oppressive stillness. Albert Battel walked through the streets of Przemysłowa, his boots echoing against the cobblestones. But the silence around him seemed louder than the sound of his footsteps. It was a quiet before the storm, an eerie calm that belied the violent action set to unfold. The gears of the Nazi war machine were in motion, and there was no stopping it now. In the officers' quarters, the reports had already been filed, the lists checked, the details confirmed. The SS had their orders. The liquidation of the ghetto would proceed as scheduled, with brutal precision. Trucks had been brought in to cart the victims away. The trains were waiting, their destinations already marked. To the officers, to the men who would carry out the operation, this was just another day, another task to be crossed off a list. To them, the Jews of Przemysłowa were little more than a logistical problem, a mass of human bodies that could be moved, destroyed without consequence. Albert knew that once the action began, the destruction would be unrelenting. It would happen in an organized, bureaucratic fashion, the precise mechanism of death that had been perfected over the years of Nazi rule. The SS officers would arrive, uniforms crisp, their orders clear. The men, women, and children of the ghetto would be herded together, loaded onto trucks, and driven to the waiting trains. The entire operation was a machine, moving with chilling efficiency. But as Albert moved through the city, he couldn't shake the image of the people in the ghetto. His neighbors, his fellow countrymen. The men, the women, the children, they were all waiting, caught in the trap. They didn't know that today would be their last day. The SS had arranged for everything, leaving nothing to chance. Albert knew exactly what would happen. The trains would leave, and the people would never return. As the action was set into motion, Albert's mind raced. This wasn't just another routine operation. He was standing on the edge of something far worse than he had ever imagined. The numbers, the lists, the meticulous paperwork. It all served one purpose: to facilitate a massacre. The very bureaucracy that had once seemed so sterile, so impersonal, now felt like a blade, cold and precise. He had signed the papers, reviewed the lists, and filed the reports. He had been part of the system that had organized this. And yet, now that it was here, it was impossible to ignore the scale of what was happening. He was no longer an observer. He was an accomplice. Albert's thoughts turned dark as he passed through the city, the weight of the coming action pressing down on him. How could he have been so blind? How could he have been part of this system for so long without fully understanding what it was capable of? It was too late to change the course of history. The train schedules were set, the trucks ready to move. The SS were in control, and nothing could stand in their way. But Albert Battel would soon face the decision that would define him, not as a soldier or a bureaucrat, but as a man. The ghetto was moments away from being emptied, its residents transported to their deaths with mechanical precision. It was all set into motion, but for Albert, something had to be done. He couldn't be a part of this. He couldn't stand by and let it happen. The system had to be stopped. Albert Battel didn't turn away. He didn't drink himself numb. He didn't quietly protest. He made a decision that would change the course of history, and possibly cost him everything. The weight of the realization hit him like a cold slap. He could feel the gnawing anxiety in his chest, the suffocating grip of fear tightening around him. But it wasn't fear for his own life. It was the horror of what was about to unfold. What he had already seen, what he had already been a part of. The ghetto was about to be liquidated, and he had signed the papers, stamped the forms, and been a cog in the machine that was now in motion. There was no turning back. Or was there? Albert stood alone in his office, the walls closing in on him as the grim reality of what was about to happen consumed his thoughts. He had known the system for years. He had followed the rules, respected the order, and stayed silent when necessary. It has always been easier that way. The paperwork, the legalities, the bureaucracy. It had kept him at arm's length from the true horrors of the war. But now, at this moment, that distance has evaporated. The action was imminent, and he had a choice to make. He could do nothing. He could keep his head down, follow the orders, and pretend that he hadn't seen the faces of the men and women who would be loaded onto those trucks and sent to their deaths. That was the easiest path, the one that would guarantee his survival. But it was also the path that would condemn him. It would condemn him to a life of complicity, a life of cowardice, a life of unspoken guilt, where he could act. He could risk everything, the life he had built, his career, his family. He could throw it all away in one moment, one act of defiance. But how? What could he do against the full force of the Nazi machine? A machine that had already decided the fate of thousands. He had no weapons. He had no army. He had no allies. But there was something Albert had, something the Nazis had never counted on. The ability to manipulate their own bureaucracy. At that moment, a plan began to form. It wasn't a plan of great heroism or open defiance. It was a plan that could only work within the very system that was set to destroy those people in the ghetto. He would make the SS hesitate. He would create a roadblock, literally, a bureaucratic obstacle that could not be ignored. He would make them doubt him. He would make them doubt the orders they had received. It was madness. If anyone suspected his ruse, he would be branded a traitor, tried for treason, and executed. His family would be marked, his life destroyed. But it was the only option. It was the only way to stop the action, even if only for a moment. Albert took a deep breath, the weight of his decision sinking in. There was no turning back. The die had been cast. He would walk out of his office, climb into a military truck, and pretend to be drunk, utterly, irreversibly drunk. He would make the SS officers believe that he was a fool, an incompetent fool, and in doing so, he would buy precious moments, moments that could save lives. As he left his office and made his way toward the truck, the cold reality of his decision hit him harder than ever before. He was about to risk everything. Not just his life, but his soul. But as he climbed into the truck and gave the driver his orders, one thought consumed him. He had to do this. If he didn't, he would be lost forever. And so, with a heart heavy with fear and resolve, Albert Battel began the most dangerous deception of his life. On the morning of July 26, 1942, Albert Battel walked out of his quarters, reeking of alcohol. His steps were unsteady, his words slurred, but his mind was razor-sharp, and his mission was clear. Stop the SS. The plan was simple, or so it seemed. Feign drunken incompetence so convincingly that the SS would be forced to hesitate, to question his authority. He had to make them doubt him, doubt the very orders they had received. long enough for him to carry out his final act of defiance. But as Albert stumbled down the narrow hallway of the officers' quarters, he could feel the weight of the decision bearing down on him, the enormity of the risk he was about to take. It wasn't just his life that was at stake. It was his career, his reputation, his family's safety. If even a single officer suspected his drunken charade was a ruse, he would be branded a traitor, arrested, and executed. His wife would be dragged into the interrogation, his children marked by the Nazi regime. And yet, as Albert stepped outside into the crisp morning air, the cold chill of fear was replaced by a surge of determination. He had no choice. The operation was beginning, and he would not, allow it to unfold without trying to stop it. He climbed into the military truck, his hands trembling slightly as he gave the driver his instructions. The bridge that connected the city to the ghetto was only a short distance away. He would block it. Simple enough if you were drunk, if you were just an officer caught in the haze of alcohol. The SS would arrive, confused by his presence, and in their frustration, they would question his orders. That moment of hesitation, that brief pause, Albert needed it to work. His plan would only succeed if they doubted him, if they saw him as an incompetent fool, too stupid to be a threat. As the truck rumbled toward the bridge, Albert tried to steady himself. He could hear the clatter of boots in the distance, the sharp voices of the SS officers as they moved into position. He had no time left. He staggered from the truck and planted himself in the middle of the bridge, the familiar, oppressive weight of his uniform now feeling like a prison. His heart pounded in his chest, but he had no time to focus on that. His hands fumbled with the papers he had pulled from his pocket, the forged orders, the nonsensical instructions that he would present as his excuse. He needed to look believable, and the only way to do that was to make them think he had completely lost control. As the SS officers arrived, their faces twisted in anger, Albert stood tall, swaying slightly, his words slurring just enough to make him seem utterly out of place. The officers barked orders at him, demanding to know what he was doing, why he had blocked the bridge. Albert simply stood there, his voice a drunken drawl as he presented his forged orders. He couldn't afford to hesitate. He had to be convincing, even if it meant making himself appear utterly foolish. The SS officers hesitated, confusion spreading across their faces. The moment was fragile, teetering on the brink of failure. They couldn't act immediately. The rules of the system, the bureaucracy they upheld, demanded they double-check orders to confirm that this incompetent officer hadn't simply misunderstood his duties. And as they argued among themselves, Albert Battel did what no one could have predicted. He opened the back of his truck, and over 30 Jewish workers, who had been doomed to die that very day, climbed inside. The officers didn't react immediately. They were too caught up in their own confusion, trying to make sense of the drunken man standing before them. But as Albert slammed the truck door shut, his heart pounded louder than the sound of the officers' voices. He had done it. He had bought them time. Now, all he had to do was drive the truck out of the ghetto and into the military barracks, where the SS could not touch them. The plan was working, but it was far from over. The stakes were still incredibly high. Albert Battel had just gambled everything on a single, brief moment of hesitation. But as the truck rumbled through the city, past the confused guards and the checkpoints, he allowed himself a brief exhale. The workers were still alive, for now. The SS officers hesitated. They didn't shoot. They didn't arrest him. Instead, they argued. And while they did, Albert Battel did something they never saw coming. He saved 33 lives. As the truck sped through the city, past the ghetto and toward the military barracks, Albert's thoughts were consumed by the lives he had just saved. 33 people. 33 souls who had been condemned to die, but who, for a brief moment, had been pulled from the grasp of death. He couldn't afford to think about what would happen next. He had to focus on getting them to safety, getting them out of harm's way before the SS caught up with him. In the distance, the barracks loomed ahead, and Albert knew that this was their only chance. The SS would be looking for them soon, and if he couldn't justify his actions with more paperwork, more bureaucratic tricks, the workers would be taken back to the ghetto or worse. The fate of 33 lives rested on his shoulders, and though fear gnawed at him, he had no choice but to keep moving. As the truck passed through the gates of the military barracks, Albert's heart slowed just a little. The workers, confused and terrified, huddled together in the back of the truck, uncertain of what was happening, uncertain of whether they were truly safe. They had been so close to the edge of death, and now they found themselves in a strange, temporary refuge. A place where the SS had no jurisdiction, a place where the Nazi machine couldn't reach them. Albert couldn't help but feel a fleeting sense of triumph. For all the bloodshed, for all the death that had already stained the streets of Przemysłowie, he had done something. He had made a difference. The workers in the back of the truck, though they didn't yet understand it, had just been given something they hadn't had a moment ago. Hope. But that hope would be fragile. The SS would not forget what had happened. They would search for the missing workers, they would question every detail of the operation, and eventually they would come for Albert. The weight of his defiance would catch up with him. He knew it. And yet, in this moment, he allowed himself to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, he had done something that mattered. The next morning, Przemysłowie was silent, except for the stains of violence and the whispers of what had been. But in a military barracks on the edge of the city, 33 Jewish workers had been saved, alive for now. Albert sat alone in his quarters, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. He had succeeded for now. The workers he had smuggled out of the ghetto were still breathing, still alive, thanks to his dangerous gamble. But the victory felt hollow. The blood of thousands had already been spilled that day. The ghetto was empty, the streets stained with the marks of what had been done. His heart ached with the knowledge that, for every life he had saved, dozens more had been lost. The survivors in the barracks knew only that they were alive. They did not know how or why, nor did they understand who had intervened on their behalf. To them, Albert was just another officer, a man in uniform who had somehow given them a brief reprieve from the death that had been waiting for them. But to Albert, the weight of his actions hung heavy. He had chosen to defy the Nazi machine, but in doing so, he had also condemned himself. The price of saving 33 lives had been steep. His own safety, his career, his future. As the days passed, Albert knew that the workers' survival was temporary. The Nazi system was not one that could be defeated by one man's actions. The SS would soon realize what had happened. They would retaliate, and they would come for him, for the workers, for anyone who had dared to defy them. The bureaucratic machinery was relentless, and no amount of paperwork or clever deception would stop it for long. But in the meantime, Albert continued to navigate the shifting sands of survival. He knew that he couldn't keep the workers safe forever. The longer they stayed in the barracks, the greater the risk that their lives would be discovered, their temporary refuge shattered. He had bought them time, but time was a luxury they couldn't afford. And so, as the days turned to weeks, Albert found himself walking a tightrope. A man who had defied the Nazi machine, but who knew that, ultimately, it would be his actions that brought him to the brink of ruin. In the silence of the barracks, as the workers tried to comprehend the fact that they were still alive, Albert Battel couldn't help but wonder whether the cost of his intervention had been worth it. They were safe for now. But the question that lingered in his mind was the same one that would haunt him for the rest of his life. What did it mean to save a few, when so many more had already been lost? Battel wasn't done yet. The SS had been humiliated, but they were not defeated. He would need to keep up the act, protecting the workers, navigating the labyrinth of Nazi bureaucracy, and ensuring they stayed alive long enough for the war to end. It wasn't enough to simply rescue them. Battel knew that. The system he had defied was still very much in place, and it would stop at nothing to root out anyone who stood in its way. The SS would come looking for the missing workers, and when they did, they would demand answers. Albert had already made himself a target, and the workers, though safe for now, were nothing more than pawns in a game much larger than any of them could comprehend. He turned back to his desk, where the mountain of paperwork awaited him. More reports, more justifications, more falsified documents. The lies, the manipulation, the careful art of bureaucratic sabotage. This was what kept the workers alive. But Albert was no fool. He knew that the system could not be subverted forever. Every forged signature, every backdated document was a gamble. A mistake, even the slightest one, could lead to disaster. As the weeks wore on, Albert found himself increasingly entangled in the web of his own deception. He filed one report after another, each one designed to explain why the workers had not been transferred to the labor camps. They were essential, he wrote. Their skills were needed by the Wehrmacht. The paper trail had to be perfect. He couldn't afford a single error, but the pressure was mounting. The SS were starting to ask questions, investigating the disappearance of the workers with increasing suspicion. Albert knew that it was only a matter of time before they discovered what he had done. He had no illusions about his safety. He was a man walking on the edge of a blade, and every step was one closer to falling. But he pressed on, because in the end it wasn't about the documents. It wasn't about the lies or the paper trails. It was about the lives of those 33 people. They were alive for now, and that was all that mattered. Albert Battel never sought recognition. He didn't want fame. He didn't need glory. But after the war, his name would be remembered, not for his uniform, but for the lives he saved when no one else would. The war ended and the world shifted. Germany lay in ruins, divided into occupation zones, its people crushed under the weight of their defeat. Albert returned to civilian life quietly, resuming his work as a lawyer in the British sector of Germany. He never spoke of his actions in Przemysłowie. He never sought recognition for what he had done. To him, it wasn't heroism. It was simply the bare minimum of human decency. The fact that it stood out as extraordinary only highlighted how thoroughly the Third Reich had corrupted an entire society. For years, Battel's story remained forgotten. The few people who knew of his role in the lives of the 33 survivors never spoke of it publicly. But time, as it often does, has a way of resurfacing hidden truths. Survivors from Przemysłowie came forward, their memories of the officer who had saved them still sharp in their minds. Their testimony, fragmented though it was, made its way to Yad Vashem, the World Holocaust Remembrance Center in Jerusalem. And slowly, the story of Albert Battel began to emerge. It was a story that didn't fit the neat, moral narratives the world wanted to tell about the war. It was messy. It was uncomfortable. But it was real. Albert Battel had worn the uniform of the Wehrmacht. He had served the Third Reich. But in a moment of clarity, he had defied the system he had been a part of and saved 33 lives. He had chosen to resist, not with a gun or a speech, but with the very bureaucracy that had been used to kill. In 1963, Albert Battel was recognized as righteous among the nations, an honor given to non-Jews who risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust. It was a recognition that came far too late for him to know. He had died 11 years earlier, never knowing that his actions would be remembered or honored. His story, buried for so long, had finally been brought to light. Battel's legacy is not one of grand heroism, but of defiance in the face of overwhelming evil. He proved that even in the darkest moments, a single act of resistance can change the course of history. And his story, like those of the survivors he helped, serves as a reminder that individual actions matter, especially when the world seems blind to the suffering around it.